Hello everyone. This content is on persuasion, and we're going to look at how is it that we become persuaded, or the psychology of changing people's minds. So consider the simple situation and consider what is your answer to the question that we'll ask. So the first piece of information, John, who is married, is looking at Linda. The second piece of information, Linda is looking at Ed, who is not married. And this is the question: is someone who's married looking at someone who's not married? So answer the question and rate how certain you are of your answer on a scale of 1 to 5. So now I'm going to give you some more information. Most people say they don't have enough information to know the answer, but that's wrong. So let's look at the information we have. John is married. Linda is either married or not married. And Ed is not married. Is someone who's married looking at someone who's not married? Either way, yes, someone who's married is looking at someone who's not married, because John is married. If Linda is not married, he who's married is looking at someone who's not married. And if Linda is married, then she's looking at Ed, who is not married. So either way, we know the answer to the question. Yes. So does this persuade you? Did you change your mind? Why? So I will invite you to watch this video. It's linked here. And if we were in a regular class, I could play it for you, but I can't do this for you right here. So I'd like you to go to the course page and take a look at this little video, because it's going to give you a really nice sense of what we're talking about in 4 minutes. So let's consider what happened. So with a dinner party scenario, you answered a question and rated how sure you were. And most likely you were probably pretty sure of your response. Then most likely you changed your mind. You saw the new information, you understood it, and you changed your mind. So what type of information does it take to persuade you to change your mind? So 3 reasons people will change their mind. One is their beliefs. So we'll look at how beliefs compelled people to retain their ideas about the reasons for the Iraq War. And we'll look at how the source of information can be persuasive. And we'll look about how people's values would affect their responsiveness to certain types of arguments. And as you think about this, think about what type of information would it take to persuade you to change your mind. Now, the dinner party example, who cares? Wasn't important. But what if it was important? What if it was like your views on President Trump? People tend to love him or hate him in this country. And you probably maybe have a strongly held view. What would it take for you to change your mind? Not that you should. I'm just asking. Or on some other type of issue that you feel strongly about. What would it take for you to change your mind? So let's look at these kind of historical events in terms of exploring these concepts. So beliefs can be a motivator of an attitude or persuader to change mind. And thinking back to this story about, not the story, but we did have a very serious war in Iraq, and we went there because ostensibly people were told there was apparently intelligence that suggested there were weapons of mass destruction, that they were being built in Iraq. And so that was the evidence that was used to persuade us to go to war. So we went to war. And then after the war, they examined and looked for the weapons of mass destruction, and there were none. And so the question is, did you change your mind? Did you say, okay, there were no WMDs? That was the wrong premise. But what really happened is many people who were presented with this correction didn't believe the correction. In fact, some of those people came to strengthen their belief that there were weapons of mass destruction, even though after we went to war and searched the entire country, that was none were found. No evidence was found. Why? Which people didn't correct their belief despite the evidence? Those whose ideology, those whose beliefs supported the then President Bush, clung more tightly to the initial conclusion, which justified a war that others opposed. So if this new finding supported one's ideology, they tended to align their beliefs with whatever conclusion most aligned with those beliefs. So those people who believed in the war and believed President Bush said, I don't believe that there weren't any. And those people who didn't like the war in the first place said, oh yeah, see, of course there was none. So evidence doesn't always change people's mind. So belief can be stronger than evidence. Secondly, we'll look at source as a motivator for attitude in the context of global warming. And this is a study in which participants were asked which of the following 12 years were among the hottest 12 years since 1850. And so people were to choose a year from among these years. And after answering, they were giving findings from the Intergovernmental Agency on Climate Change, showing that 11 of these 12 years were the hottest since 1850. There's only one that wasn't the hottest. 2000, 1995 was. All of these were the hottest years since 1850. Only 2004 was cooler. And people changed their mind. Most people changed their minds after getting this information. Why? Why in this case did they change their mind? Well, probably they didn't have hard beliefs in place as they did about the Iraq War, but also the source. This source, the Intergovernmental Agency on Climate Change, was trusted by participants. And the third thing we'll look at is values as a motivator of attitude in terms of military spending. And in this study, people of different political backgrounds, and mind you, all of this is prior to President Trump, liberal, conservative, rank their values. And liberals tended to value fairness, that is, having everyone treated equally and having equal opportunity. And conservatives tended to value loyalty. We need to be more true to individuals in our in-group, like to our own nation, not other nations, that sort of thing, to our own clan, to our own race. So those are two very different perspectives held by liberals and conservatives. So now, which argument will be most persuasive to which group if you want to persuade people to increase military spending? Argument A, the military provides jobs and opportunity to young people from all walks of life. And argument B, the military unites the country under a single effort. So if you were talking to a group of liberals, which argument would you offer? And if you said you'd offer argument A, that would make a lot of sense because this supports their value system. And argument B would be more persuaded by the second argument, that the military unites people under a single effort, because that would hold true to the loyalty value. So what we find is values that are aligned with individuals' values will offer the greatest persuasive power. So as we look at those three, let's consider what we have going on right now with voter fraud. So is it due to beliefs, values, or source? So after former President Trump suggested that election fraud had occurred, his supporters believed him to the point that they staged an onslaught of our Capitol on January 6th, I'm sure you know. And now in Arizona, we've had a year-long review led by Republicans, that conducted by the Republican amateur auditors, who concluded after their process that President Biden had actually won by a slighter, larger margin than the original records have shown. So no voter fraud. And this was Republican conclusion. Yet, this is a quote from The Guardian shortly after that finding. Quote, "The reality of the recount in Arizona was a letdown, but this seems to have had no effect on the story spun up by Republicans about voter fraud. Why not? Is it beliefs? Is it values? Or is it the source of information?" You think about this yourself. I'll ask you this in the participation question. So why do some arguments persuade and others don't? Well, audience characteristics are a big part of it. You need to know your audience. So you need to know, what are your audience beliefs? Whom do they trust, or what source would be persuasive? And what do they value? And if you know those things, you'll be better able to frame a persuasive argument. So this seems pretty simple. So we should, if we know this, we should be able to persuade people of anything, because now we know what to think about. But this isn't always true, because we as humans tend to make assumptions that others hold the same beliefs, values, and trusted sources, but they don't. And I'll give you a case in point from my own life in a moment. So how do we find out? Well, listen, and learn from what we listen. So we have to read sources, listen, pay attention to sources outside of our own in-group, so to speak. So before I go to my own example, I'd like you to think about a situation when you tried to persuade someone to change their mind. Maybe when you were young, you tried to persuade your parents to allow you to do something. Or you tried to persuade a friend to change their perspective on another friend. Maybe you wanted to persuade a colleague to change their mind about the boss, or to start coming in on time, or something like that. Or maybe you wanted to persuade a friend that their new partner wasn't being true to them. Maybe you wanted to persuade your community to conserve water, or persuade people to using the lake facilities to take their litter with them, or persuade your landlord that pet cats do not necessarily destroy houses. What techniques did you use? How skillful were you? And were you successful? Now, the case in point about how we often don't know others' beliefs and values, or what sources that they would value, comes when I moved to another town, a little tiny town on the western edge of North Dakota, and I'd lived in Wisconsin all my life. And Wisconsin had at that time a pretty strong environmental effort, and recycling was, we'd done it since 15 years already. When I moved to North Dakota, I was really surprised that there wasn't a way to recycle. So one of my goals when I moved there was to help to get a recycling program initiated. And so I knew that I would need to have two audiences that would need to be persuaded. The city would need to be persuaded because they would have to fund new recycling bins and so forth. And individual citizens would have to learn about recyclables, because they would be expected to rinse out their things and disrupt their kitchen arrangement with the extra trash can, and put out a recycling bin and trash can on appropriate days. So there were two groups, and I used the first person singular I, even though there were other people who shared this. At the time, I didn't know them, and so I was working alone initially. So first off, what about the audience characteristics? First, I have to know my own beliefs, values, and sources. So my beliefs, well, waste takes a long time to decompose, and our landfill doesn't allow it to do so, and we must tend the earth, our home, our children's homes. That's like my beliefs. My values were that we have stewardship of the earth, and I value that we should take responsibility for the waste we produce. And my sources, I don't even know the source exactly because it was so deeply embedded, but probably it had a foundation in the EPA, and certainly going to natural centers, environmental centers, helped to cement these beliefs. So then that's my belief. And so this is what I would assume everyone has, and that really was true of me. Like I had much to learn that when I moved to another area, people have different beliefs. And so I was glad I listened, because in general, I found out that the beliefs of the people where I was living were like, we have lots and lots of land. There's land all around us, so what's the worry? And they didn't have a lot of knowledge about like the waste decomposition or that sort of thing. The citizen values weren't also like mine, like they hadn't had the same background. At least they didn't consider stewardship in the same way that I did. And more, I felt like more the values that would be persuasive had to do with money. Like we have to be frugal, we have to spend money carefully, very much a rural kind of poorer, like a poorer community sort of mentality. And it's just poor in the sense that like you never waste, that kind of value system, and that we don't waste money either. And so we shouldn't spend money on something that's frivolous. And we shouldn't rely on public funds. So I would say that was a dominant value rather than this kind of earth responsibility. And the trusted sources, well, definitely there they felt the EPA should not be trusted. Already that kind of Trumpist thinking was coming into play, and the EPA had already been really lambasted, and in that region those arguments against the EPA took. But they did trust local leaders because they knew each other, they knew deep families, they knew each other for a long time. So here we have differences. So now my skillful means and our skillful means it became, when I met the other people who worked with me on this, were that we had to step back from our own beliefs and talk to the people we were working with. And so, you know, I got on a committee and spent a lot of time listening and tried not to talk too much. And I'm glad I did, because I was able to learn that, you know, for them to have recycling, it would mean it would have to be hauled hundreds of miles. There were no recycling facilities there. So there were big fuel costs and transportation costs. And of course, there were savings, because I also learned that it was going to be time for them to build a new landfill soon, which was going to be really expensive. And by recycling, we could put that off a few years. So there were two sides to that coin. And then persuading individuals, well, we did teach about recycling. We realized there was like a knowledge void, a bit of a knowledge void among some families. And so teach the children seemed to be a way. And we also made it accessible by setting up recycling collection days at certain locations in the city. And some of that had been starting before I even arrived. And then we collaborated with a local newspaper to set up paper recycling bins in a public area. And they already had a truck that was coming out to get the paper waste, so that worked. So we had partial success. But in the end, the message of saving money rather than save the earth was the more persuasive message. So I give you this because this relates to your own capacity to persuade others. And so this is just an example of how this was done. So two very similar models of persuasion suggest that there are two pathways to change people's attitudes. And I don't want you to get caught up in these names. Honestly, these words in red and green are the important words to get out of this. But there are two models. So the first is the elaboration likelihood theory. And basically that just means, what is the likelihood that this audience member is going to require you to elaborate or give more information on why they should do something? And so they say that some audience members are going to be taking the central route. And that means that they are going to be persuaded by careful consideration of the merits of the information. And so there's a strong likelihood that whoever wants to persuade them is going to have to elaborate and give more information and strong arguments that appeal to cognition or thought. And then the peripheral route, this is a type of persuasion that results from people will respond more to surface factors, like how appealing, how exciting is the message, how credible do they think the speaker is, how attractive is the source of the message, or how well produced was it exciting? And so they're attending more to peripheral factors that aren't central to the argument. So there's less likelihood that this audience member who's using the peripheral route will require elaboration or the provision of good, strong information. And you can see this is aligned almost exactly with the heuristic systematic theory. And this offers that some people do systematic processing, and in certain situations as well. And in these situations, people who are working this way would think carefully about any information that's available to them, and they'd be using their central pathways to form an opinion on whether the information is accurate or valid. You can see how closely aligned this is to this central route described in the elaboration likelihood theory. And heuristic processing, people don't think carefully but are relying on mental shortcuts to make decisions through peripheral pathways like these mentioned here, and so they're really quite parallel, these two methods. So from henceforth, we'll just use peripheral and central, since that's the common theme of both of these. So how do you decide what route is needed? Well, you need to consider your audiences. So you'll want to use the central route if the audience is motivated, analytical, knowledgeable about the subject. Then those, if that's the case, like they're motivated to learn more about this issue, they tend to think things through deeply, they already have a little bit of a foundation of knowledge so they can understand the arguments, then they're going to put high effort into processing a cognitive-based message and will make a lasting change in their attitude if the message is persuasive. This will be a well thought out decision. You would want to use peripheral route methods if the audience is really not that interested, not that motivated on this topic, not tending to be that analytical or like to think a lot, not in their heads that much, or if they don't know very much about the subject, then they'll put low effort into processing deep information, but they might be persuaded by surface aspects of the message. In this case, the change in attitude will be temporary. So this lies it out. The persuasive message will want to use the central route if the audience is motivated. That will result in high effort. They'll really evaluate the message and a lasting change in attitude. The peripheral route for audiences who are not motivated, not analytical, those individuals will put low effort into understanding the message, and so they'll be more persuaded by cues outside the message. And the attitude change will be temporary. What factors influence attitude change? Well, what source characteristics make a difference? Who do you believe? Your sister, your father, mother, your best friend, brother? Do you believe messages that come from your local authorities, your teachers, professors? Do you believe messages from people who are members of your community, your tribe, your clan, or people with credentials? How about newscasters? Or how about some particular newscasters, Rachel Maddow or Sean Hannity? How about certain friends on social media? When they post something, you tend to believe it. What about celebrities? Your favorite musician? How about that really attractive person you just met? If they tell you something, will you believe it? What about your personal doctor, your dentist, your counselor, those people who are giving you services? So think about who you believe. The source characteristics that tend to be important are attractiveness. So is the speaker attractive, famous, appealing? This will get attention right away. And people who are using the peripheral route, not going more deeply, might be persuaded by this attractiveness. Now, for someone who's going to use the central route, that attractiveness might get their attention, but it's not going to persuade them. Presumed expertise. Does the audience think the speaker knows something, even if he or she doesn't? And in this area, the people with presumed expertise are those includes people like those close friends and family. Anyone on that previous list that you tend to be persuaded by, this is what we're talking about. Or even professionals who are wise in other areas, but not in this one area. Like, for example, your psychology professor commenting on a political issue that may not be in her domain, even though she might be wise in other areas. Or your doctor, pastor talking about political issues that might not be really knowledgeable about the issue. Or even, let's say a doctor who is talking about, say, an immune system disorder, but that's not their in-depth training, so their knowledge might be limited in that area. So you can usually tell someone who really is an expert because they acknowledge areas that they don't know much about. You ask them a question, they say, oh, I don't know enough about that. People who always know the answer usually aren't the true experts. And then actual expertise, does the individual have real expertise or experience in the area, credentials or a history of work in that area? We could consider Dr. Fauci to go again to that national stage, who had really great actual expertise, but was pretty much maligned for not agreeing with the president. So these are characteristics of the source that can make a difference. We also have message characteristics that can make a difference. Boy, would this message get your attention? How about this? This is a Subway ad. How about this? An advertisement for people not to start using meth. You'll never have to worry about lipstick on your teeth again because you'll lose your teeth. I don't have anything to say about that. How about this message? Stay home, protect our elders. What characteristics of this message might make it persuasive? And this one, I'm actually going to show you a little video because this was a message that was made way back in the 1970s that was extremely persuasive against pollution. And as always, it was really powerful for me. Like, this image stayed in my mind, even though I saw it for the first time as a child. I think it impacted my whole environmental perspective. So that's a pretty powerful, persuasive message. But what were the characteristics of it that made a difference? And again, I can't show you videos within this setting. So I've actually just posted up this video too on our webpage, and maybe you want to watch it. And you might think I'm just joking about this, but no, this message, it really was probably a life changer for me and for many people. So take a look at that on our website. So the message characteristics that we would look for then are the quality of information. So people who use central processing are going to require high quality information, while others can be persuaded by pseudo-facts stated in simplistic terms. Like, usually by pseudo-facts we mean, well, there's sort of a fact, but it's stated incorrectly or not quite accurately. But you're probably going to have good sourcing to really be persuasive. All that APA style stuff about getting good sources for your information, that's what we're talking about here if you're trying to persuade an audience that uses central processing. As academics, that's what we should use. Vividness of information, how colorful is it? How much does it garner our attention? Vividness may be persuasive, especially to those using the peripheral route. That'd get everyone's attention, and that maybe sex sort of advertisement by Subway was effective, and the soap advertisement with the guy with blood on his arms, that was probably pretty effective. So they're pretty vivid. And they might also have some of the next bullet point, emotional appeal and fear-mongering. Like, we are invaded for being invaded. That was one of Donald Trump's messages, and it tends to bring out like emotion-driven camaraderie based on arbitrary need to defend. Like, if you can make people afraid, you can sometimes persuade them. That meth ad with the teeth, the girl with the destroyed face and destroyed teeth, this may, be a part of emotional appeal and even a little bit of fear to keep people from getting addicted to that harmful substance. And then cultural appeal, messages like, all of your people like this, appeal to your sense of belonging. And I thought that possibly that advertisement about saving elders with respect to COVID, I thought that might have been that appeal too, appealing to your sense, your culture, cultural appeal. and what audience characteristics might make a difference if you're trying to persuade. And an audience can be a group like this, or a single person, or a few people. I show a bigger audience here. Oh, and what I was getting at is what would you use to persuade these audiences? That first one, you're in a pretty academic setting. How about right here, this really powered up group? They're all protesting, Chicago teachers, they're standing up, they're having solidarity on behalf of their students. What would you do to persuade these people of something? I'm fired up. How about this? This is a group of mostly older white people, Belagana, sitting in a church. What would you do to persuade them of something? Same message as you'd use on those Chicago teachers? How about this? These are Muslim girls who live in a fairly sexist environment. What would be persuasive to them? How about these academics? These are all professors at someone's graduation. What kind of an argument would you do to persuade them of something? Would you show them a superstar advertising their product, or would something else be more persuasive? How about this? How about Navajo people? You want to persuade them not to drink the water that's near the uranium mines because it's contaminated. How do you target? How do you shape your message so that they get it and are safe? So the audience characteristics that are found to make a difference are, first, this is like a trait, need for cognition. How cerebral is your audience? How much do they like to think? And I'll show you a little bit more about this on the next slide, but people who really need to think things through, they're going to be taking that central route, and they're going to need a certain kind of message that has really good sourcing and really good arguments and good information. So I'll show you the scale for that trait on the next slide. Age. Well, do you need the same message as your grandparents? In what ways might the messages differ? Or mood. How about that rally that we looked at with those Chicago teachers? What kind of mood were they in? What's the mood of your audience? Are they like at a festival, feeling cheerful? Are they at a protest or rally? Are they at like a required school event, so they're feeling resentful? You know, are you talking to a parent or spouse and they just got home from work and they're feeling stressed? What's the mood? How about the size? How big is your audience? If you have a really big audience, you're going to have a different kind of a message than if you have a small audience, because you're going to have some level of intimacy with a smaller audience. And finally, diversity. Are you speaking to a homogeneous audience that is all one, say, race or gender or age, or is it mixed? Are there any issues with a group if it's homogeneous? How would you tell your message differently if it was directed like toward the people you're most familiar with? How would this impact your message? And this is that need for cognition scale that I mentioned. And you can see some of the items on it. I prefer complex to simple problems. I like to have the responsibility of handling a situation that requires a lot of thinking. Or thinking is not my idea of fun. And you can see the R there. That means if someone agrees with this statement, it means they have a low need for cognition. How about, I find satisfaction in deliberating hard and for long hours. Or compared to this one, I only think as hard as I have to. That's another reverse statement. I prefer to think about small daily projects to long-term ones, another reverse statement. The idea of relying on thought to make it to the top appeals to me. Or I really enjoy a task that comes up with new solutions to problems. So this is just an example of the need for cognition scale that will, it's just what that trait is like, of need for cognition. So just the summary here, people are persuaded by a variety of factors. The type of message will vary depending on the characteristics of an audience. An audience is highly motivated, knowledgeable, and having a high need for cognition will probably require a message containing a lot of elaboration. They will be using the central route, put high effort into processing it, and will have an enduring change in attitude. Whereas an audience who's not motivated or knowledgeable will use the peripheral route of processing, put low effort into processing it, but rely on mental shortcuts and sustain temporary change in attitude. And we would want to consider messages that will change attitudes. We'll consider the following: the source characteristics. Again, we have to find the source that's best for the audience. The audience characteristics, like the characteristics will impact the age, size, diversity, mood of the audience, as well as the extent to which they have a need for cognition. And characteristics of the messages that are vivid, emotionally compelling, and or designed to appeal to one's sense of belonging, will have a greater impact on those using the peripheral route. So we'll end here. I hope this was helpful. Watch those 2 little short video clips, 5 minutes worth.